Authority is a big issue in America today as the battle for power or authority dominates the political scene. There's a fight between the president and Congress and the courts as to who has the most power, who has control or authority, which, if you're a student of American history, it's not surprising, because the founders intended it that way as a means of holding government in check. Three separate branches, equal but separate and distinct, designed to keep each other from getting out of control. They realized that when government has too much power concentrated in one place, it gets out of control. And so they were determined to keep that from happening. And if you're up on history, elections are designed to give us, we the people, ultimate authority by giving us the power to say who sits in the seats of authority. Now, of course, this discussion today isn't about who is or isn't in power in American politics. I use our political and social culture to illustrate spiritual truths, but I'm not the least bit interested in debating political theories or political parties. I'm not going to defend any particular party, and I'm not going to attack any particular party. I'm here to discuss the problems that all of them have and use them for spiritual illustrations, or to illustrate spiritual issues. In fact, that's why I'm using this tonight as an introduction to our continued series, Lessons from the Life of Jesus, Studies in the Book of Mark, because we come to a section where Jesus demonstrates his authority, where the word and concept authority dominate the whole text. In fact, that's the title of our study, is Authority, Mark 1, verses 21 through 45. Now, when I say verses 21 through 45, I know that's 24 verses, or 25 verses, actually, do the math correctly. And some of you who have been watching this, and I hope that's all of you, hope all of you have been watching, and you know that for me to cover that many verses in one study is unusual. In fact, some of you may be snickering at the idea that I'm going to cover that many verses. But don't laugh. It will be done, because the study is about the concept of authority as demonstrated by Jesus in three areas here in the text of Mark chapter 1, verses 21 through 45. It's a lengthy text, and so we'll read parts of each section in relation to the area of authority being demonstrated by Jesus. Now, if you remember, last time we covered Mark 1, verses 12 through 20. And we left Jesus standing on the shores of the Sea of Galilee with his first four chosen apostles, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Over time, he'll add 8 more to make the 12. But for now, we find him in Galilee preaching. And it's there in Galilee we see him demonstrate his authority or his power over three things: doctrine, demons, and disease. And yes, I had to alliterate. It's just the way I have to do that. It helps me remember this more easily. And so as you mark these down, you can make the notes in your text how Jesus is showing his authority over doctrine, over demons, and over disease. And so let's begin looking at the first section here, Mark 1. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about the idea of authority. When we talk about authority, it has a lot of different connotations and meanings for a lot of different people. But as you read this section, we see that the word authority pops out a couple of times in the text, but the idea permeates the entire text. The word is only in there twice, but the idea permeates it from start to finish of the text. And let me show you what I mean. In verse 22, he says this: for he was teaching, or they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. And then in verse 27, they were all amazed, so that they debated among themselves, what is this? A new teaching with authority. So there are the two times he uses the word authority, but notice what they refer to as his authority. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. But as I said, that's the only two times the word authority is used, but the idea of commanding authority and demonstrating his authority permeates the entire text. Go back to verse 25. In verse 25, Jesus talking to the demon spirit that is inhabiting this man, commands him to come out. Verse 25, Jesus rebuked him, saying, be quiet and come out of him. That's verse 25. And then again in verse 34, he was again dealing with his demons, says that he was not permitting them to speak. So when he spoke to these demons, they had to do what he said. Whatever command he issued, they had to comply. They had to submit. They couldn't argue or debate with him. And then in verse 41, he deals with a disease. And he tells the man, I am willing, be cleansed. The man had a terrible disease, and Jesus said, be cleansed, and the disease was gone. It went away. It was healed immediately. So this is demonstrating his authority, the authority over doctrine, the authority over demons, and the authority over diseases. Now, when we talk about authority, let's define authority, and we need to know what it means. Well, first of all, it's the idea of the right or power to act. And you'll notice on the monitor behind me, you have the 4 definitions, and they all kind of build on each other. The first is power of choice, liberty of doing as one pleases. I mentioned at the beginning how the American electorate, the people who have the right to vote, supposedly choose our leaders. We have votes, we vote, and we determine who gets into office. All right? Because there's a document called the Declaration of Independence that says that we all have individual rights. We're all born equal, and that we all have rights that are inalienable. So no one can take them away from us. So it's the idea of the power of choice, liberty of doing as one pleases. And then add to that the physical and mental power, or the ability or strength to do what we please. So one is the right, and the other one is the ability. And the third is then the power of authority to influence others, to have an influence over others. And that leads then to the power of rule or government. So then you go from the ability or the right to choose what you want to do to the ability or right to tell others what to do. And that's the way power and authority flows. But let's talk about this first idea here, the power of choice, and what it arises from. The word literally is an interesting word. It means out of self or out of being. It's exousia. I know that's a word everybody uses in their common everyday conversation. Well, no, it's from, which is the word ek, or out from, and eimi, which is the form of to be. I am. Being as a right or privilege. And so it's saying the idea of authority is acting out of the right, as we said at the very beginning of the definition, the right to act freely and independently. And then eventually to have the right to order and demand compliance from others. When you think of this, think of it in terms of what God said to Moses at the burning bush. When God sent his angel to Moses, and Moses said, who shall I say sent me? God said, tell him, I am that I am. The self-existent one. Now, that's the point there. So that's the idea of authority. God has the right, the authority to send Moses to bring his people out because God is the ultimate I am. He is the one who has eternal existence. No one existed before him. No one created him. No one tells him what to do. He has the right or authority as the creator of the world to order us to obey and expect compliance. So when we talk about God's authority, we're talking about the right to command and demand our total obedience, the power of rule or government. As king, God has the right to give orders and expects us to obey. And as Jesus has been given all authority, and Jesus rules now as king in heaven, reigning over his church, over his kingdom. Not some millennial kingdom in the future, but he's already reigning now as king. He has a right to give orders and expects us to obey. In fact, that's why anytime I talk of a study of the New Testament church, I stress the importance of reviewing the idea of kingdom from the standpoint of the king. Kingdom, in the sense of the New Testament, and the sense of God, derives from the king. The king is the one who has a realm or a territory over which he can exercise authority. Christ has ultimate authority over the entire world, but he rules specifically and explicitly in the lives and hearts of those who submit to him, to his will, his church. And so when we talk about the church, when I study the church and I talk about it, I try to get people to focus not on the group of people or the organization that has arisen among those people. And the New Testament only sees an organization on a local level, but that's a different study. But focus especially and particularly on the authority of Jesus Christ, the King. And even though Jesus took on the form of a servant and submitted himself fully to the Father's will, his authority over man was and is complete. That was the outstanding mark of his ministry. And that's what astounded the people, his authority. When Jesus spoke, he didn't say, well, I don't know, maybe. He didn't do like I do sometimes. Well, I think this passage might mean that or it might mean this, because God did not give me the authority independently of my own to say, well, this is what it means. Jesus had that authority. He had the divine privilege, prerogative, the dominion and rule as king, as divine king. So he has the right to say what we have to do and expect us to comply. Well, let's look at now the three sections here, the authority over doctrine. That's in verses 21 through 22. And look at here, Mark chapter 1. Let's read verses 21 and 22. It's on the monitor behind me. Verse 21, they went into Capernaum, and immediately on the Sabbath he entered the synagogue and began to teach. There's Mark's favorite word, immediately. Mark is just snapping through this stuff as fast as he can. Immediately. And there's some time frame. We don't know how much time lapsed between him choosing these four apostles and him going into Capernaum. But he goes in there, he enters the synagogue and began to teach. Verse 22, they were amazed at his teaching, for he was teaching them as one having authority and not as the scribes. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's just notice, first of all, he went in the synagogue. Synagogue just is basically a word for a local congregation of Jews. They weren't Christians, they were just Jews, and the synagogues were scattered in every town across Judea and Galilee and in many places across the world where Jewish men lived. They would form a synagogue, a local congregation of Jews. And so everywhere Jesus went, he would go into the synagogue and teach. And the Apostle Paul, when he went out on his missionary tours, he would go into cities, and if there was a synagogue there, he would go in there and teach. That's because that's where the people would be who would know something about the concept of the promises of Jesus the Christ, even though they may not accept him, and most did not, but that's where he would go to preach. And so the news of Jesus had already arrived there. It's not like Jesus just walked right out of the wilderness and the temptation there in Mark chapter 1 and in verse 12, or verse 13, and walked into Galilee into the synagogue in Capernaum. There's probably about a 6-month time frame where he did some preaching down in Jerusalem and in Judea, had been to a feast in Jerusalem, had been to Cana, had done a number of things. So his reputation has started to grow. In fact, he was getting a reputation of having teaching and baptizing more people than John the Baptist. And so they knew about him. And so when he got there, they said, hey, Jesus, you're that teacher. What do you have to say? Talk to us. What do you want to teach us? And so he invited, and so he began to speak, and it says that they were amazed at what he had to say. Going back to verse 22, they were amazed at his teaching. The word amazed is a very descriptive word. Literally, it means to strike out of their senses. We would say it blew their minds. That's what he did. He just, what he had to say was mind-blowing to them. They were used to the scribes. They were used to the teaching that was esoteric and unclear and just not absolutes and maybes and possibilities, because they would just go along and they would be evasive, and they would talk about mysticism, and their teaching was muddled, and they would wrap their words around so many what ifs as if they had no meaning or value. Think of it this way. They would read a passage. Let's say they would read a passage from Isaiah 53. Jesus could read Isaiah 53, and of course he had the advantage of saying, I'm the fulfillment of that. He did that at Nazareth, and that didn't go over very well. But he could say, I'm come to fulfill that. Here's what this means. Now, a scribe would read that, and he'd say, well, scribe Benjamin said X. Scribe Zechariah said Y, and scribe Hananiah said Z. I tend to go with what Scribe Benjamin said, but Hananiah made some good points, so I'm not really sure. And sometimes as a preacher, when I look at things I'm not sure about, I kind of take that. I can't sit down and say, well, God told me this is what it means. Now, some passages are very clear, but some are not so clear, and so it takes a little bit of time and effort to work our way through that. Jesus didn't do that. He didn't do any of that. He would read the scripture and explain what it meant, because, think about this for a moment, as the author of the Old Testament, he is the eternal Logos, after all, John 1, he knew what it meant. And so when they would ask, well, what does this passage mean? Or when he would read this passage, this means X, period. No further discussion, no need to say, well, wait a minute, what about scribe so-and-so over here? No, who cares about those scribes? Here's what it means. He could do that. He had authority over doctrine. That meant not so much that he could ignore it. He couldn't ignore it. He couldn't disobey it. He had to be sinless. He had to be perfect. He had to keep that law perfectly. So he had to know it perfectly. And in the process of knowing it perfectly, he was able to perfectly explain what it meant. Because sometimes keeping the law perfectly meant him doing things that the scribes thought were wrong. But their interpretation was incorrect. That's the important key to that. He knew what it meant. And think of it, the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, chapters 5, 6, and 7. Jesus would frequently say, throughout that text, would say, you have heard it said, but I say unto you. You have heard it said, but I say unto you. Over and over again, he did that. He said, this is what you think it means, but here's what it means. He could do that. Then right after the Beatitudes, he made it very clear that the law was subject to him. Matthew 5, verses 17 through 18, he said, I didn't come to destroy it. Now what that meant is, he could have. He says, but I came to fulfill it. Until all things are complete, nothing will pass from the law. So he's making it very clear. He came to fulfill the law. He is the fulfillment of the law. He knew what it meant. Jesus wasn't saying the law didn't apply to him and he could do whatever he wanted. But he was saying that he had the authority to tell them what it actually meant. And that's what was blowing their minds. All right? Well, let's go to the next thing. It's power over and authority over demons. And this is Mark chapter 1. We'll read verses 23 through 27. Just then, there was a man in their synagogue. So there was a guy in the synagogue with an unclean spirit. Now, how anybody else would have known? No, there's no way to know. But Jesus knew that. And Jesus' presence did something about demons. Every time he was around a demon, there were demon possessions going on. And every time Jesus came around, they freaked out. His presence drew a reaction from them. Other people may have no idea that that person was demon-possessed, but when Jesus came around, the demon had to expose himself or show himself to the Lord. Verse 23. So just then there was a man in their synagogue with an unclean spirit, and he cried out, saying, what business do we have with each other, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God. So he knew who Jesus was. And he had to speak up. And Jesus then in verse 25 rebuked him, saying, be quiet and come out of him. Throwing him into convulsions, the unclean spirit cried out with a loud voice and came out of him. They were all amazed, so that they debated among themselves, what is this? A new teaching with authority. So here's a man with authority who can command a demon. He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him. That's authority. That's power. They know this man has power. You know, the demon couldn't challenge him. There was no question here, no argument between the demon spoke out to Jesus, but when Jesus told him what to do, he had to do what the Lord said. He could not disobey. He could not refuse to submit to the will of God. Now, one of the issues that this raises is the idea of demon possession. Demon possession. And that attracts a lot of discussion and attention even today. And it's so far off topic of what we're talking about. The fact here is that Jesus had authority over them. We know demons exist, but there's no way to know whether they possess anybody because no one today has the power of the Holy Spirit to see them, to see that someone is demon-possessed, or to cast them out. That authority ended with the apostles and those upon whom they laid their hands at the first century. But we know they exist and that they work through lies and deceit because in Ephesians chapter 6, turn over to Ephesians chapter 6, Paul is writing to the church of Ephesus and he tells them about the weapons of our warfare, but he tells them about the kinds of weapons we have because of who we're fighting. Chapter 6 and verse 10. It says, finally be strong in the Lord and in the strength of his might. Put on the full armor of God so that you will be able to stand firm against the schemes of the devil. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood. This is not a physical battle with swords and guns, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. And then he talks about the spiritual weapons we have. And the offensive weapon, the one that we use to strike down Satan and his demons and his servants, is not a physical sword, but the spiritual sword, the Word of God, truth, the revelation of God's will. That's how we defeat Satan. That's how we're able to win this battle. But Jesus has this authority over them. Everywhere he shows up, when demons see him, they speak out. But they can't withstand him. They can't say no to anything he commands them to do. Well, let's go back to Mark and let's look at the next section here in Mark chapter 1, the last section, and that is over disease. He has power over diseases. Now, in this he says in verse 30 and 31, he goes to Simon's house. Now, Simon's mother-in-law, verse 29, immediately after they came out of synagogue, they came into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. Now Simon's mother-in-law was lying sick with a fever, and immediately they spoke to Jesus about her. And he came to her and raised her up, taking her by the hand, and the fever left her, and she waited on him. So when he came in, he raised her up and healed her. And the important thing is here, besides showing that Peter was not the first pope, he was married and had a mother-in-law, is Jesus' authority over disease. This wasn't a, well, let me pray over her and let's give her, some pills here that she can take, or some medicine, or some, a little wine and some kind of oils and stuff that she could take that will heal her over time, and just let her stay in bed and rest. No, he healed her. She was immediately healed. And you know how we even know she was immediately healed? Because she got up and went to work. I mean, this isn't some idea of the misogynist, a woman's, she got to get up and get to work. No, she was healed. That's the point, is that she wasn't sick anymore. When he touched her, when he laid his hands over her and said, be healed, she was healed. And any woman, any self-respecting host is going to get up and get things ready. And so she gets up and starts to serve her guests. This is showing us the power that Jesus had over diseases, the authority over disease. Now, just a little side note, it also shows that there's dignity in service. The fact that she's serving speaks well of her. And when we think about the people that we meet in day-to-day life, and whatever your job or work may be, it may be changing bedpans in a nursing home. That's dignified work because you're serving somebody. You're doing things that people need. You may be changing tires. You may be helping people find groceries. You may be changing diapers in a maternity ward. You may be selling cars. It doesn't matter what you do. Installing cable for the internet in people's houses. Whatever it is you do, it's good, as long as it's honest and not involved in sin, is to be honored. There's a simple majesty to her being able to go back to work and serve Jesus and his friends. But the point here, of course, is that his power was his power over the disease. One other passage, just look here in Mark chapter 1, and that's the second one in verses 40 through 42. He continues teaching, he's going out, he's casting out demons, and he's preaching. And verse 40 says, a leper came to Jesus, beseeching him and falling on his knees before him, saying, if you are willing, you can make me clean. So this leper, this man who has leprosy, and it's an awful disease, another text says it was covered with it, so it means his body was just eaten up with leprosy, and he comes to Jesus and said, if you're willing. See, he's trusting Jesus. He said, I know you can do it, if you will. And Jesus says to him in verse 41, moved with compassion, Jesus stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I am willing, be cleansed. The touching is not what healed him. It's the power of God. When Jesus said, be healed, be cleansed, that's where the power was demonstrated. And immediately the man was healed. It wasn't, let's rub some oil on this, let's get you some therapy and some surgery here to cut away some of the scarring. None of that. This was an immediate response to the power of Jesus, the authority of Jesus. The disease had to obey him. It could not resist the will of God. Now, the reason he touched him is that this shows his compassion. That man, think of it in these terms. That man probably hadn't been touched in years by anybody, except maybe other lepers, and probably even not then if he's that bad. Because you just didn't do it. You were afraid you might get the disease because it was contagious. It was a virus is what it was. And if you were around the virus and you got exposed to the virus and it got on you, you could get the disease. Jesus touched him. and said, "Be clean," and he was. What a powerful demonstration of the power and authority of Jesus. That's what he's saying here. That's why this text is, and that's why I said we would cover the entire 25 verses in our study today, this one study. Let's just end with a couple of questions. Will you let him exercise authority over your sin? Will you? Or will you insist on him doing things your way? You know, this is something that everybody has to think about. Everybody has to wrestle with. What am I going to do with Jesus? His authority is absolute. The only question is, will you submit? Will you do what he says? He has the authority. Are you going to listen to him? I hope you will. I hope you will. If you got any questions about what you need to be saved, or what you needed, if you need to find a church where you can worship and work with people who are determined to submit to the will of God and will help you understand what it takes to submit to the will of God, reach out to me, Facebook Messenger, or email at anamericanmissionarybg@gmail.com. I'll be happy to study with you, help you find out what you need to do to be saved. I'll be happy to put you in touch with people who live near you, who can help you do that as well. Because he has all authority, and we need to do what he says. And I hope you will. And also, I just want to thank you for watching, and I hope that you'll come back next time. Until then, I'm James McClenney, and I'm praying that your heart will be filled with the glory of God.